Hi guys, welcome back to Golden Reviewer. So this is the iPhone 13 Pro Max. It has a much improved camera hardware compared to its predecessor. And this is the Samsung Galaxy S21 Ultra, which has been one of the best camera phones for year 2021. So I've been using the iPhone 13 Pro Max for close to 1 month. And I have some impressions of the camera that I want to explain to you. And in general, I'll say that this camera system is a disappointment for me. And in this video, I'll tell you why, and I'll be using the S21 Ultra as a reference point for most of the comparisons. So alright, let's get into it. Just to make it not as harsh, we'll start with the pros of this camera system. And I've listed 4 main pros that I experienced. And next, we'll talk about these 4 points one by one. So the very first nice thing that I want to talk about is the much improved macro mode. The iPhone 12 Pro Max literally had no macro capability at all. So when you want to take some photos of an object up close, you are out of luck. But the iPhone 13 Pro Max added the macro mode into the ultra wide angle lens, and just look at the results. It's like 10-20 times closer than the iPhone 12 Pro Max. And in fact, it was even able to focus closer than the S21 Ultra, which I think was one of the better macro cameras out there. So that's a big improvement. However, I do notice that the image taken on macro mode is a little bit dull and just not as pleasing as what I get from the S21 Ultra. So this might be due to the worse ultra-wide sensor on the iPhone 13 Pro Max, which is just not as good as the larger sensor on the Galaxy. The next pro I'm going to talk about is the responsiveness of the iPhone camera. It's just one of the best in any smartphone, hands down. So there is minimum lag in the camera app overall. Everything is just responsive and fast, and there is literally no shutter lag, and the focus is super fast. And especially when you're taking photos of moving subjects like your kid or your pet, you will more likely to get a clear photo than the Android phones like the Samsung or Xiaomi or Huawei or whatever. Then the next nice thing about the iPhone is that the viewfinder is almost rendered in real time. So you have all these Nightmode or HDR effects in the viewfinder. Basically, what you see is what you get. Just look at this comparison of the viewfinder screenshot of the iPhone versus Galaxy, and you see that the highlighted areas, those are overexposed on Galaxy, while they are well maintained on the iPhone 13 Pro Max. Although if you actually take the shot and after the post-processing, those highlights are recovered on the Galaxy as well, but you are just not able to see this effect in the viewfinder. But then of course, the iPhone is not 100% real time. If the contrast is just too high, they also overexpose in the viewfinder and you still have to wait for the image to be processed. And here I'm showing you an example of that. But overall, it's still much better than what Android can offer right now. And the last pro of this iPhone 13 Pro Max camera system I want to talk about is that it's overall pretty reliable when the lighting condition is not too harsh. Just look at this daylight and indoor shots of the iPhone 13 Pro Max versus the S21 Ultra. Other than some difference in the color profile, they are mostly similar and both are very good if you ask me. So I'll say this is a very good point and shoot camera. And usually you don't need to worry about it producing a terrible or unusable photo. So most of the time, the photo will be just fine. But then let's move on to the cons of this camera that I noticed. And let me explain why that I think this camera is really a big disappointment for me. And I think if you are actually going to buy this device, these cons are more meaningful for you, because you have to know this before you actually pay for the device. It's no small money, right? So let's get into it. So the first point I'm going to make is that this camera lacks real zoom capabilities. The 3x plus digital zoom just cannot compare with the best of Android. A lot of Android devices nowadays has 4 times, 5 times, or even 10 times on the S21 Ultra. So at longer zoom ranges, the iPhone 13 Pro Max just cannot compete with these Android devices. Just look at these zoom shots and see how much worse it is compared to the S21 Ultra. And this is a hardware thing, because Apple just refuses to add in any extra camera. There is no way around this. The second issue I'm going to talk about is that the stabilization on the new iPhone seems to be a step backwards. The stabilization is just not that great. And this is already very noticeable in the viewfinder. When you switch to the 3x zoom lens, or even beyond 3x, you'll notice that it's very shaky in the viewfinder. And this creates a very bad experience, and I think this shouldn't be the standard of the iPhone. I didn't have this issue with the iPhone 12 Pro Max, and I don't have this issue even with the 10x zoom on the S21 Ultra. Just look at how stable it is compared to the iPhone 13 Pro Max. So the next issue I'm going to talk about is that the ultra-wide is still not good enough. Apple just gave the ultra-wide a bigger aperture, but it still used the small and old sensor. I think it's 1/3.6 inches, while on the S21 Ultra it's 1/2.5 inches. So while the image quality is indeed improved by quite a lot from the iPhone 12 Pro Max, it's still nowhere near the level of the Android flagships like the S21 Ultra. Just look at these comparisons and you can definitely see a very apparent difference. Next point I'm going to talk about is that the HDR effect on the iPhone is pretty disappointing. When Smart HDR was first introduced, it was one of the best in the industry. But over the years, Apple didn't seem to improve it all that much, and currently is lagging behind the competitors. So more often than not, you will get overexposed highlights and underexposed or even crushed shadows. This is very common with the new iPhone. I think it's even worse than the iPhone 12 Pro Max. Just look at this example. We see that the two Samsung phones actually has very good shadows, while the two iPhones tends to crush the shadows. There is basically zero detail in the shadow, but the iPhone 13 Pro Max is actually slightly worse than the iPhone 12 Pro Max in this group of photos. And it's just not as good as the Android competitors like the S21 Ultra, which has very reliable and beautiful HDR effects in all lighting conditions. So the fifth point is that the low light image quality from all the lenses are not that great. And night mode, which is supposed to help in low light conditions, sometimes does not even activate. This is also very curious to me, because sometimes the iPhone 12 will decide to use night mode, while the iPhone 13 does not, in the exact same situation. And then in that case, the iPhone 13 will actually produce a much worse image. Here is an example of that happening. The iPhone 13 Pro Max just decided not to activate night mode even in this scenario. And then the result is just not as good as the Z Fold 3, which is not even the S21 Ultra. I think it's Apple's algorithm doing funny things, and I hope they will improve this in future updates. And my sixth disappointment with the iPhone 13 Pro Max is that the color and white balance are not that great at all. We all know that iPhone used to be the phone that produced a better color and better white balance, but it seems that this is no longer the case. In many scenarios, the iPhone 13 Pro Max will actually lean towards a cooler white balance, which makes the color a bit dull and washed out, which I don't really like. Sometimes it also tends to over-saturate the colors. Just take the example of this flower. I think it's quite apparent that the color is very wrong on the iPhone 13 Pro Max, while the S21 Ultra produces a much more true-to-life color. Take example of this shot of the grass. It's also quite apparent that the colors on the iPhone is just off. And what about this next example? It's a beautiful sunset, but the colors on the iPhone is just too washed out and too cool. It just doesn't represent the real scene. And what makes this worse is that when you are switching the lenses, the white balance doesn't seem to hold consistent. You can see the white balance changing from warm to cool and then cool to warm like this all the time. It's very annoying. And this doesn't happen on Samsung. You can see that when I switch between the 4 lenses, the white balance is rather stable and all the colors are pretty consistent as well. And that difference is also very apparent in the end result. So the photo of the iPhone is just too cool and the colors are not correct. Next, my 7th point is that the portrait mode on the iPhone has not been updated for many years, and the edge detection algorithm has not improved either. To be honest, I don't use this much, but I love to see some improvements here as well. Next problem I have with the iPhone 13 Pro Max is that Apple still hasn't added any AI mode, especially for food. I think it's very common for us to take pictures of food and we want it to look nice. And this has been done on Android devices for many years. But it's just not available on iPhone. So whenever you take a photo of food, you have always to do some post-processing by yourself, or the result will not be nice. And the last problem I have with the iPhone 13 Pro Max is that it likes to over-sharpen the photo a lot. This is especially noticeable when there is text in the photo. So I think Apple put in some AI to detect the text and then do some special sharpening of it. But the end result is just not beautiful. You can see here that in these examples, all the text seem over sharpened. They even have these jagged edges, which is really not that nice. And this doesn't stop with text only. It happens for a lot of other subjects as well. Sometimes this over sharpening just makes me think that the image is an eyesore. And I'm really not a fan of this. Over the years, Samsung has toned down their image sharpening, but I don't understand why Apple is doing this now. Okay guys, so that's all I want to share with you after using the iPhone 13 Pro Max for 1 month. And my conclusion of this camera is that it's okay, but it's definitely not the best. I know that some of the reviewers say that this is the best camera in any smartphone, and I cannot agree with that at all. And I think any person that used an Android flagship like the S21 Ultra will not agree with this. It's just lacking in so many areas. And if I give S21 Ultra a 90 points for camera, I can only give a 70 points for iPhone 13 Pro Max. But of course, the bottom line is that it's not bad. It's not a bad camera at all. It's just not great. And you will be disappointed if you come from the best Android devices. And many of my friends who upgraded from the iPhone 12 Pro Max are also very disappointed, because Apple promised huge improvements during their events, and they didn't deliver. And my suggestion is that if you are upgrading from iPhone 12 Pro Max to iPhone 13 Pro Max just for the camera, don't do it. It's not worth the money. 90% of the time, you won't notice a difference. 5% of the time, you will notice it's getting worse than the iPhone 12 Pro Max. And maybe another 5% of the time, you'll notice some slight improvements. I really hope that this is resolvable with some firmware updates, because after all, the hardware is indeed improved. So it's apparent to me that the software and the algorithm is the problem here. So alright guys, that's all for this video. If you find it helpful, please like, subscribe and share it to your friends. Thanks for watching and see you next time.